The Supreme Court has preserved access to the abortion drug Mifepristone with a unanimous ruling. It's the first major abortion ruling since the overturning of Roe versus Wade. The court did not rule on the merits of the FDA's approval of the drug. The justices simply found that the plaintiffs who brought the case lacked standing.
Definitely some good news out of the Supreme Court today, but there is a giant caveat because the issue of women having the ability to access Mifepristone or the abortion pill could be left to the Supreme Court eventually, and they might actually decide to do away with what the FDA has done in expanding the availability of this abortion pill to women across the country. Now let's take a step back and talk about the Supreme Court's ruling, why they ruled the way they did, and what the future could hold for women who seek to access the abortion pill Mifepristone. So basically, this case was brought by anti-abortion doctors and medical organizations amid a wave of conservative laws severely limiting access to abortion around the country. The FDA decided to step in and do something in response to that. But because of those restrictions, women have become more and more reliant on medication abortion rather than surgical abortion. So let's take a look at this chart because it'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. You see that steep incline in the chart. And what that says is in 2020, 53% of abortions were performed through medication, but that spiked to 63% in 2023, making it the new target for the anti-abortion movement. And to be sure, they certainly did target the abortion pill. Now, the plaintiffs in this case against the pill argued that the FDA loosening the regulations around Mifepristone was unsafe. They didn't make a good case, in my opinion, in arguing that, but basically, what they were targeting is the fact that the FDA had approved Mifepristone in 2000 as part of a 2-drug regimen to end pregnancy. But over the course of 2 decades, some of the restrictions revolving around Mifepristone had been loosened by the FDA. So the agency loosened those restrictions that it initially placed on the drug. In 2016, for instance, it allowed women to take the drug later into pregnancy. At first, they limited the drug to about 7 weeks, and then they expanded it to about 10 weeks pregnancy or gestational age of the fetus. It also permitted non-physicians, like nurses, for instance, to prescribe Mifepristone. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA announced it would no longer enforce the in-person dispensing requirement. Last year, after the doctor's lawsuit was filed, the FDA formalized that decision, allowing the drug to be dispensed through the mail.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
Now, as you can imagine, conservatives in the country didn't like that because they want to restrict abortion as much as humanly possible, if not outright ban it. But the FDA and several prominent medical groups, including the American Medical Association, told the Supreme Court that Mifepristone is safe. The argument that it's unsafe is just ridiculous and unfounded. So safe, in fact, that let's do a little bit of a comparison here, a great comparison to Viagra. If you take a look at this, it shows that the risk of death by taking Viagra is nearly 10 times greater than taking Mifepristone. Nonetheless, the plaintiffs wanted Mifepristone to be taken off the market, and the case bounced around in the lower courts as what typically happens when something is challenged through the court system. And then finally, the Supreme Court decided that they would step in last year, and they ordered that the status quo around Mifepristone remain in place, so nothing change until the justices were able to review that case. But this part is super critical, everyone. This is the caveat that I'm talking about. The actual legal merits of this challenge to the FDA was not adjudicated. Okay, so for now, Mifepristone is safe, but it's not because the Supreme Court justices looked into the safety or lack thereof of Mifepristone. In fact, what they looked into was the fact that, well, the people who brought the case, who are challenging the availability of Mifepristone, really had no standing. In other words, this case could actually make it all the way back to the Supreme Court eventually, and the Supreme Court might actually rule differently the second time. But for now, we're okay, Mifepristone is still there. Now let's go to the issue of standing. What does that mean? None of the doctors who submitted declarations to the lower court actually prescribed Mifepristone, and none pointed to an instance when they were potentially required to complete an abortion for a patient who had complications after taking that drug. So if you have standing, you can't argue that this is an unsafe drug and that it has created some sort of injury or some sort of issue. When again, these doctors who brought the case don't even have to deal with Mifepristone. You have to have standing in order to make the argument that the plaintiffs in this case were making. Here's more information.
I think it's really important that the court spoke here with a unanimous voice saying, here's what you need for something called Article 3 standing. You need to be injured. You can't be asserting somebody else's injury. That injury, that government action, you need causation to show that your injury was caused by whatever you're complaining about. And you need to be able to show something called redressability, or you need to be able to show that you can get a remedy. And what we see throughout this opinion is the court saying no, no, no to all of the plaintiff's allegations here, that they can be the ones to try and assert this suit.
These were people who didn't want to use the pill. These are doctors who never wanted to prescribe the pill. These were people who just objected to it and said that the FDA didn't do enough to look at the safety issues around the drug.
Okay, can we just acknowledge how these people are total goofballs? So again, just to really simplify this, the Supreme Court essentially told the plaintiffs, you have no business bringing this case to us because you yourself were not harmed. You weren't harmed physically, you weren't harmed monetarily, you have no standing in bringing this case forward. In the majority opinion, Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote the following: we recognize that many citizens, including the plaintiff doctors here, have sincere concerns about and objections to others using Mifepristone and obtaining abortions. But citizens and doctors do not have standing to sue simply because others are allowed to engage in certain activities, at least without the plaintiffs demonstrating how they would be injured by the government's alleged underregulation of others. Under the Constitution, Kavanaugh wrote, a plaintiff's desire to make a drug less available for others does not establish standing to sue. So he's absolutely right about that. And this is the reason why the majority of Supreme Court justices ruled along with Brett Kavanaugh. And he also noted that federal law already protects individual healthcare providers who have objections to performing abortions for moral reasons or religious reasons. He says, in short, given the broad and comprehensive conscience protections guaranteed by federal law, the plaintiffs have not shown and cannot show that FDA's actions will cause them to suffer any consequence or conscience injury, right? So he's basically saying, listen, the loosening of the regulations has had no impact on you, and you're the one bringing the case. You don't have standing. You can't really sue for this. So it is good news that the case was rejected, but you shouldn't really breathe a deep sigh of relief. I think that it's okay to have a momentary sigh of relief considering the abortion pill is still safe. But the ruling does leave an opening for 3 states, Missouri, Kansas, and Idaho, to basically quickly try to revive the challenge before federal judge Matthew Kasparian, who is a very well-known anti-abortion judge. And the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a conservative legal group that brought the lawsuit in the first place on behalf of the anti-abortion doctors, has made it pretty clear that they're not going to give up and they're gonna use those states in order to keep this fight going. They're very persistent. And that's why I say, even though we've got some good news today, things could turn around rather quickly given how motivated these individuals are to limit or completely restrict access to Mifepristone. And because the underlying argument wasn't even addressed in the Supreme Court's decision, it really doesn't tell us much about how the court would rule in the future if a legitimate challenge with standing is brought forward. Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas, the two that we should look out for the most, in my opinion, seemed open during oral argument to the idea that when deciding how to regulate mifepristone, the FDA should have considered the Comstock Act, long dormant legislation from the 1800s that prohibits the mailing of any drug, medicine, article, or thing designed, adapted, or intended for producing abortion. And that really does suggest that the conservative justices may in fact side with the plaintiffs if the case is brought forward by individuals with standing or under different circumstances. Plus, Scotus, the Supreme Court, is still separately considering a separate abortion case, which we should be concerned about, that it has to do with what happens when pregnant women show up to the hospital with medical emergencies in states where abortions effectively have been banned. So that decision will have a significant consequence on the reproductive freedoms and rights of women as well. So stay tuned for that. So again, for the moment being, we do have some good news on mifepristone, but it could be temporary good news considering the motivations of the plaintiffs here, how incredibly persistent they are, and how we do still have an incredibly conservative Supreme Court that, of course, has already reversed the landmark Roe v. Wade, which granted abortions to women in America up until the point of viability.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.